guys, I'm Miss Brandy. This is the elementary lesson for this week. I thought that I would come to our classroom today so that it would feel a little bit more like normal. So today, first off, I want you to think about a time when you've made a promise, or maybe generally the types of promises that you make. So that could be something like promising your parents that you'll clean your room, or promising a friend that you'll play with them at recess. And you know what, as humans, sometimes we don't always keep our promises. Like maybe you tried really hard to keep a promise, but you couldn't for some reason, or sometimes we don't actually even want to keep our promises because it doesn't sound like fun. But today we're going to talk about God's promises and how God always keeps his promises. So we're going to talk about a few times in the Bible when we can remember that God made a promise and then he kept it. So I've got this timeline, because we love timelines, and we're going to talk about a few different stories on this timeline, okay? So the first one is probably a story that you know really well. In the book of Genesis, the very first book of the Bible, there's this guy named Noah. And God says to Noah, he says, "Noah, I need you to build an ark. There's going to be a flood." And so Noah's like, "God, I don't know. It doesn't really flood very often. And an ark is a really big boat. I don't know if I need one of those." But you know what? Noah listened to God and he built a boat.
Build the ark. I'll tell you what, you build it, I'll fill it. And if anybody asks, tell them flood's coming. Oh, and you might need this.
Okay, so what do? I grab the wood and then, okay.
I will never flood the earth again like that. He promised he would never do that, and the way he promised that was by showing Noah a rainbow. And one more. And has he ever flooded the earth again? No, he has not. And so that's the first story where God, he made a promise to Noah and then he kept it, right? Because he's never flooded the earth again. He also promised that Noah was going to flood, and that happened too. So then, around this time, shortly after this, God made another promise. And he promised Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, who are some of the guys in Genesis, you might have heard their names before, he promised them that he would give their descendants, all the people in their family after them, this wonderful land, and in the Bible, a lot of times they refer to it as this land of milk and honey. So it's this wonderful land where they can grow everything that they need and live this wonderful life. And so he promises them this land. So God makes a promise here about this land of milk and honey. And so he makes a promise, and then this thing happens in the middle where they go to Egypt, and you guys might remember this story as well. But they go to Egypt and they become slaves. But God promised them that he was going to give them this awesome land, and they were not currently in it. And so God was fulfilling his promise, and he sent Moses, you might remember him, to go rescue them from slavery in Egypt. And there's this really cool story where Moses rescues them. There's a lot more to the story, but part of it is that he rescues them from the Red Sea. Or he brings them through the Red Sea, right? So he parts it. You might remember something like that. He parts the Red Sea and they walk right through and escape out of slavery.
staff, you shall do my wonders.
And so after that, all of the people, they obeyed God because they were like, wow, He's rescued us out of slavery. We love God. And so for a while, put a happy smiley face, they were obeying God, and He gave them His laws, and they obeyed His laws, and they worshiped Him. And then eventually, they stopped doing that. And so we're gonna put a sad face down here, because after He rescued them, they stopped obeying Him, and they stopped worshiping Him, and they worshiped other things and other gods that weren't the one real God. And so He was like, you're not obeying my laws. I'm not gonna let you go to this wonderful land that I wanna give you when you're not worshiping me or obeying me. And so for this whole time, which was 40 years, He let them just wander around in the wilderness and not go to the land of milk and honey and apple trees. And so eventually, because God made this promise way back here, even though the people had disobeyed Him, He eventually brought them, because He promised, to this land of milk and honey. So there's trees there where they probably grew apples, and there was honey, and it was wonderful. And the people, when they were there for a while, they were so thankful that God had given them this land that it was awesome. And they were happy, and everything was good, and they were obeying God, and they were worshiping Him, and it was good. But as that has happened over and over again, they stopped eventually. So everything was great, and they didn't need God anymore, and so they stopped worshiping Him and obeying His laws. So not good again. We have another frowny face. And so what happened there, we learned about a couple weeks ago, is that Jeremiah, who was a prophet of God, God told him, and he told the people that they needed to start obeying God again, or they weren't going to be able to stay in this awesome land of milk and honey and apple trees. And so they didn't listen to Jeremiah, like we talked about a few weeks ago. And you know what happened? The Babylonians, God allowed the Babylonians to come and conquer them. So the Babylonians came from Babylon up here, and they came and they conquered the Israelites in this wonderful land. And the Israelites went back to Babylon, and they went into exile. So we call that the Babylonian Exile. We've been talking about that. So they ended up back in Babylon because they weren't obeying God or worshiping Him or listening to Him. But God made another promise. And in Jeremiah 29:10, he told Jeremiah that he was going to allow the Babylonians to capture the Israelites and put them in exile, but he would only make them stay there for 70 years. Because he promised, again in Jeremiah 10, that he would give them this great land of milk and honey. And after 70 years, just like he said in Jeremiah 10, he brought them back to this awesome land. And that is what our story is today. is that God, he brought them back to this land, but how he did it is that he used this guy. His name was King Cyrus. So here's King Cyrus, and he was this strong king. Give him a crown because he's a king. And he conquered the Babylonians, and he said, Israelites, even though he wasn't an Israelite, he didn't really believe in God, but he sort of acted like he did at least. So he said, Israelites, you can come back to this wonderful land that your God gave you if you like to. And so a bunch of the Israelites, they came back to this wonderful promised land that God had given them. And our story today is about how, because God was so faithful in keeping his promise and bringing them back to this land and doing exactly what he said, the people, they started worshiping him and obeying him and loving him again. And so where our lesson ends today is the people were loving and obeying God again. And they started to rebuild the temple that had been destroyed. And so in our story today, they don't build the whole temple. We'll talk about that next week. But they build the foundation of it. And they start offering God burnt offerings like they were doing before. And God was really pleased. And so this was they built the foundation of the temple, but they didn't actually build the temple yet. So we can see on our whole timeline here that over and over and over again, God made a promise and he kept it. And God made a promise and he kept it. And he brought them, even though the people started disobeying and not listening to him, he still kept his promise and he brought them into this wonderful, prosperous land of milk and honey. And then, even though they stopped listening to him again, he made them another promise that he would do the same thing again. And he did. He brought them back to that land. So, we can see here that God always, always, always keeps his promises, which is still happening today. So, God promises us in the Bible that he promises us a lot of things. A couple of them are that he will always be with us, right? He doesn't necessarily promise us that everything in our whole life will always be really good. Certainly it wasn't always really good for the Israelites, but he does promise us that he will be with us through all of it. And he was with the Israelites through all of this as well. So that's something that God promises us. He also tells us that he is a good God and that he loves us. And I think we can see that through all of these stories as well, and how he took care of the Israelites, even though they didn't always obey him. So I think we know from today's lesson that God always, always, always keeps his promises.